Welcome, traveler of dark history. Tonight, the candles burn low, the air hums with old secrets, and the echoes of prayers mingle with the faint cries of the forgotten. What you are about to hear is not myth. It is a shadow carved into the soul of Europe, a time when faith was both weapon and shield, when a whisper could condemn you, and when salvation came wrapped in chains. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten echoes of power and pain, then subscribe, because this journey into the Spanish Inquisition has only just begun. It began with the sound of bells. Granada, 1492, the final stronghold of Muslim rule in Spain, had fallen. King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile stood beneath banners of crimson and gold, proclaiming unity under one faith, Catholicism. The crowds cheered, the priests blessed the air, and incense rose in curls of sweet smoke. But beneath that scent of devotion, another smoke would rise, the smoke of burning flesh, rising from the pyres of the condemned. Spain was reborn, or so they said, but every rebirth requires blood. The monarchs saw their new kingdom as fragile glass, beautiful but ready to shatter under the weight of heresy. Centuries of coexistence among Muslims, Jews, and Christians had ended. Suspicion grew like rot behind closed doors. The question was no longer, who do you pray to, but are you loyal to the crown? And so, in the name of unity, fear became law. The idea was whispered first by men in robes, not armor. Priests murmured to the throne that heresy spread like disease, unseen, contagious, and deadly to the soul. Heretics, disguised as Christians, walked among the faithful, poisoning belief from within. Only a new kind of power could purify the land. The Inquisition was not born overnight. It was built, layer by layer, with signatures, seals, and oaths. Pope Sixtus IV granted the monarchs permission in 1478 to establish a tribunal in Castile. The words were formal, but their meaning was fire. Spain now had divine authority to hunt its own people in God's name. The first inquisitors arrived in Seville. Priests turned judges, draped in black, and armed with parchment and the cross. They spoke softly, yet their words could unravel lives. Lists were drawn, names whispered, confessions demanded. A merchant's wife accused her neighbor of lighting candles on Friday night, a sign perhaps of secret Jewish faith. A baker failed to attend Mass one morning, perhaps a hidden Moor. A doctor's success stirred envy, surely aided by demons. Truth no longer mattered. Belief did. And belief could be bought, sold, or broken under torture. The first flames rose in the Plaza de San Francisco. It was late afternoon. The sun bathed the white walls of Seville in gold. But as the crowd gathered, another light began to glow, orange and cruel. A procession moved slowly through the square, the condemned in white tunics, painted with symbols of their sin, serpents for deceit, flames for heresy. The crowd watched in silence, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers. Children clutched their mothers' skirts as the inquisitors read out the verdicts: guilt, confession, repentance, and death. Then came the fire. It was said that the first man burned that day sang psalms as the flames consumed him. His voice wavered, not from pain, but from faith, a final defiance that shook even the priests who condemned him. The smoke curled upward, black against the sky, and the people cheered. They believed they had witnessed purity restored. But behind the cathedral walls, the inquisitors knew the truth.
Fear had proven itself more powerful than any sermon. Tomás de Torquemada was a man who understood that truth better than anyone. He was not yet the Grand Inquisitor, but his name already carried the weight of iron. Born into nobility, he was a Dominican friar with eyes that burned brighter than the candles on his altar. To him, heresy was a plague, and he was the physician sent to cure it. He preached that mercy was sin if it allowed impurity to live. Under his guidance, tribunals spread across Castile like wildfire. Each town received its inquisitor, its notaries, its cells. Churches became interrogation halls. Confessionals became traps. Every accusation began the same way, a wooden container placed near the altar. No one knew who had written the note, and no one dared ask. The accused could not face their accuser, nor call witnesses. The Inquisition's power rested on silence, the silence of the fearful and the screams of the condemned. For many Spaniards, the Inquisition became a ghostly presence, invisible yet everywhere. You could hear its footsteps long before you saw its face. At night, carriages without insignia rolled through narrow streets, stopping before unsuspecting homes. Doors splintered, candles spilled wax onto cold floors, and within moments the accused vanished. They were taken not to prisons, but to secret houses of penance. Underground, where the air smelled of damp stone and old prayers. The interrogations began gently, a question, a plea, an opportunity for confession. But the inquisitors were patient men. They would speak of forgiveness, of salvation through truth. Then, when the prisoner denied their guilt, the tone changed. God sees all, they would say, even the lie you tell yourself. Torture, they insisted, was not punishment, it was persuasion.
One account survives from Seville, 1484. A young woman named Isabel, accused of conversing with a known converso, a converted Jew, was brought before the tribunal. She denied all charges. The inquisitors smiled and let her below. She was shown the potro, the rack, a long wooden frame with ropes and pulleys. "We do this with sorrow," the friar said, "but the soul must be saved." Her wrists and ankles were tied. As the wheel turned, bones shifted, sinews screamed. Between each turn, she was offered a chance to confess. "Tell the truth," they urged. "Tell the truth, and the pain will stop." After an hour, Isabel whispered, "Yes." The inquisitors leaned close. "Yes, what?" "I spoke with her," she gasped. "But we talked of bread, not of faith." It did not matter. Her confession had been written before the question was asked. The Inquisition thrived not because people were evil, but because they were afraid. Fear was its currency, obedience its reward. Villages turned inward, neighbors spied on one another, families fractured under suspicion. The more people confessed, the more others were accused. It was a self-feeding fire. To the monarchs, this was success. To Torquemada, it was divine order. To the common people, it was survival. And so the smoke continued to rise. Spain entered its golden age with blood still wet on its altars. Gold from the New World poured in, cathedrals grew higher, and yet beneath the marble and glory, the dungeons stayed full. The Inquisition became an institution, not of faith, but of control. It did not simply punish heresy, it defined it. Whatever the crown feared became sin. Historians would later write that the Spanish Inquisition executed over 30,000 people, but numbers cannot capture the true horror, not the way a mother trembled when her son was taken,
nor the way silence fell over entire towns after the bells of judgment rang. For Spain, unity had been achieved, but at a cost that could never be measured in gold. As night falls over our first chapter, picture this: a quiet street in Toledo, a single candle flickering in a window. A man kneels to pray, whispering words of faith that could save or destroy him. Outside, the echo of boots draws near. This is how it began, not with armies or kings, but with belief turned inward, sharpened into a weapon. The Spanish Inquisition was not just a court, it was an idea that power, when sanctified by religion, can justify anything. And the world would never be the same.
The Cathedral of Seville stood like a mountain of faith, its walls adorned with gold, its altars gleaming beneath the soft glow of candlelight. But behind that beauty, something darker stirred. In the echoing silence between prayers, whispers began to spread. They crawled through pews and cloisters, weaving through confessionals like unseen serpents. There were not the whispers of sin, they were the whispers of fear. By the late 1480s, the Spanish Inquisition had become a living organism. It breathed through the priests who preached, the scribes who copied accusations, and the nobles who funded its courts. Its veins pulsed not with blood, but with rumor. Within the cathedral's walls, where the devout sought solace, the seeds of suspicion were quietly sown. It was here that the Inquisition perfected its most powerful weapon: silence. Every Sunday, the church bell summoned hundreds to Mass. Among them were merchants, soldiers, widows, and servants, all kneeling shoulder to shoulder beneath the towering arches. As incense rose, the priests spoke not only of God's mercy, but of his wrath. "Beware the false Christian," they warned, "for he kneels beside you." Eyes darted across the pews. Who among them had failed to cross themselves? Who muttered prayers too softly or hesitated before the sign of the cross? Every gesture became evidence, every silence a confession. The sermons were crafted with care. The priests spoke of Judas, of betrayal, of how even Christ's closest follower could harbor deceit. Trust, they said, is the devil's mask. And so the people stopped trusting, not just their neighbors, but themselves. At night, families whispered prayers behind locked doors. Some avoided lighting candles, fearing that a flicker at the wrong hour might mark them as heretics. Others buried old books in their gardens, Hebrew texts, Arabic poems, or even medical journals that mentioned stars and humors. Faith was no longer measured by love, but by fear. The Inquisition's reach extended through a vast network of informants: priests, confessors, merchants, even children. They called them familias, the family of the Inquisition. These were not soldiers, but listeners, disguised among the faithful. A familia could be anyone: a baker's apprentice, a nun, a scholar. They watched for gestures, for the wrong words spoken after Mass, or the quiet refusal to join in the chants. Each observation became ink on parchment, and every parchment could end a life. In the archives of Toledo, one such report still survives. It was written by a man named Alonso Ruiz, a tailor and loyal servant of the Inquisition. His words, in faded ink, read, "I observed that Diego de Morales does not eat pork, and that he avoids the sign of the cross when passing the church. He claims illness, but I believe otherwise. His wife burns herbs on the Sabbath. Their faith is doubtful." That report was enough. The Morales family disappeared within a week.
The cathedral became both sanctuary and snare. Confession, once sacred, turned into surveillance. When a sinner knelt before the confessional grate,
The priest's questions often reached beyond the soul's sins. Do you know of any who have failed in their duties? Have your neighbors kept the fast? Have you heard anyone speak against the church? Many confessed more than their own sins. They confessed others. And those names, once spoken, could never be unsaid. Priests were told it was holy duty to extract truth, even by deceit. Some kept records of conversations never meant for the Inquisition's eyes, only to later recall them when the tribunal demanded names. This is how the web was spun, with faith as thread and fear as glue. The inquisitors understood psychology better than any physician of the time. They knew that fear of damnation outweighed fear of pain. They didn't always need the rack or the whip. Sometimes a single question, whispered in the right tone, was enough. A merchant might be summoned to the tribunal not because he was guilty, but to feel guilty. The inquisitor would greet him warmly, offer wine, and speak of salvation. Then he would say, almost casually, "Tell me, my son, do you know why you are here?" The man, confused, would shake his head. "Ah," the inquisitor would sigh, "then perhaps your conscience is not yet clear." Days would pass. The merchant would toss in his cell, wondering what sin he had forgotten, what word he had spoken. When the questioning resumed, his voice trembled before the inquisitor even opened the Bible. He would confess to anything. And so, the Inquisition learned that the human mind, once cornered, was its own instrument of torture. Within the great cathedral, another presence loomed, the Tribunal of Faith. It was not a courtroom as we know it, but a theater of control. The inquisitors sat in shadowed thrones, robes heavy and dark. The accused stood alone, flanked by guards and candles. No witnesses, no defense, no plea. Only the script of judgment repeated across the kingdom. When the inquisitors spoke, their words echoed off stone like thunder. "You are charged with heresy against the Holy Church." And the accused, a trembling farmer, a scholar, a widow, could only respond, "I am innocent." To which the inquisitor would reply, "Then why does your neighbor say otherwise?" It was a trap that no one could escape. Even truth under the Inquisition became dangerous. For if you denied the accusation too strongly, they said your conviction was pride, and pride, too, was sin. Inside the cathedrals of Spain, the line between worship and judgment blurred. Holy water sprinkled on the condemned, hymns sung during executions, all wrapped cruelty in sanctity. The people began to see pain as purification, and inquisitors as divine surgeons cutting away corruption. But there were those who doubted, quietly, desperately. Some priests, weary of blood, tried to temper the zeal. They spoke of Christ's mercy, of forgiveness. Yet even they risked accusation. Softness toward heretics, the council warned, is heresy itself. Thus, compassion became crime. One such priest, Father Esteban, wrote in his diary before vanishing, "I have heard confession from 100 souls who are more afraid of man than of God. They pray not for redemption, but for protection. The Church has become a mirror of Caesar, and in that reflection, I no longer see Christ." His diary was found years later, sealed in a wall.
the Inquisition had erased him from record, as though he had never existed.
Meanwhile, the populace adapted. People learned to speak in codes, to express grief or anger without words that might betray belief. In markets, sellers blessed their goods twice, once for God and once for the Inquisition. Children were taught prayers by rote, but forbidden to ask their meaning. The inquisitors called it harmony. The people called it survival. There were also those who thrived, opportunists who used the Inquisition for profit. Merchants accused rivals to seize their property. Servants denounced masters who had beaten them. Even nobles learned to wield accusation as a blade in their own feuds. The Inquisition pretended to be impartial, but gold, favors, and influence often shaped its verdicts. When power and piety intertwine, truth becomes a commodity. In one chilling case from Zaragoza, 1493, a nobleman named Hernando de Vargas accused his cousin of blasphemy during a family dispute over inheritance. The cousin denied all charges, but witnesses, all servants of Hernando, testified otherwise. The tribunal found the man guilty. His estate was seized for the crown and for God. Hernando inherited everything. Within a month, he too was accused, by the same servants now seeking their own rewards. The Inquisition devoured itself as greed replaced faith. As the years passed, the sound of prayers inside cathedrals began to blend with the hum of scribes copying confessions, the creak of leather bindings closing around testimonies, the hiss of candles burning beside interrogation rooms. The church had become omnipresent, not as a sanctuary, but as surveillance. From the pulpits, inquisitors preached unity through fear. Better a world of ashes, one sermon declared, than a kingdom infected with heresy. And so the people obeyed. They knelt not out of devotion, but out of terror, a terror sanctified by prayer. But power, once tasted, demands more. Torquemada's shadow now stretched across Spain. His tribunals operated with chilling efficiency. He called it cleansing the soul of the nation. Others began to call it something else, a machine of torment disguised as salvation. In cathedral after cathedral, the same scene repeated: the flicker of candles, the murmur of Latin prayers, the echo of chains beneath the choir's song. The voice of faith had been replaced by the machinery of power. And yet, within those vast stone walls, among the whispers and smoke, one truth began to take shape: that faith, when weaponized, does not save souls, it consumes them.
As we leave this chapter, imagine walking through one of those cathedrals at midnight. Moonlight glinting off gold altars, the faint smell of incense mingling with something metallic in the air. You think it is candle smoke, until you realize it is blood, long dried, never cleansed. The whispers you hear are not prayers. They are the echoes of those who confessed things they never did to save themselves from a God they no longer recognized. And so, the Inquisition's cathedral stood tall, a monument to devotion and to fear. In the heart of Castile, under the heavy air of late summer, a figure walked through the cloisters of a Dominican monastery. His robes were simple, black as night, his head bowed beneath the weight of both faith and ambition. Around him, novices knelt as he passed, not out of devotion alone, but out of fear. His name was Tomás de Torquemada, and before his life was over, that name would become a curse whispered in every corner of Spain. They called him El Martillo de los Herejes, the hammer of heretics. If the Spanish Inquisition was a storm, Torquemada was its lightning. Tomás de Torquemada was born in 1420,
into a world trembling on the edge of transformation. Europe was emerging from plague and war. The printing press was stirring ideas that would one day challenge popes and kings. Yet Torquemada saw none of that as progress. He saw it as decay, a moral infection eating at Christendom's heart. He entered the Dominican order at a young age, dedicating himself to a life of austerity. He slept on stone, fasted often, and spent nights in silence. His devotion was absolute, his self-denial total. Those who met him described a man of cold discipline, with eyes that burned as though lit from within. He believed that sin was not to be pitied, but purged, even if the sinner had to burn with it. By the time Ferdinand and Isabella rose to power, Torquemada was already a trusted confessor to the Queen. She found in him what she desired most, divine certainty. When he spoke, it was with the conviction of one who believed God himself whispered through him. And when the monarchs debated how to unify their fragile kingdom under one faith, it was Torquemada who offered the solution. Cleanse Spain of unbelief, and she will shine as the light of God's empire. In 1483, the Pope appointed Torquemada the Grand Inquisitor of Castile and Aragon. It was the first title of its kind, and with it came a power no man of the cloth had ever wielded before. The Grand Inquisitor stood above the bishops, beyond the reach of nobles, answerable only to the crown and to God, and sometimes even they feared him. He controlled a network of tribunals across Spain, each acting as extensions of his will. His signature on a document could condemn hundreds. His silence could save none. He established the infamous Inquisition's Manual, a book that detailed the methods, rituals, and bureaucracy of persecution. It described how suspects were to be arrested, interrogated, and judged. It codified torture not as cruelty, but as divine necessity. For the salvation of souls requires that the body be chastised. It was a manual not of faith, but of control. And under Torquemada's hand, it became scripture. His first act as Grand Inquisitor was to purge the Inquisition itself, to remove those who questioned the extremity of his methods. A soft heart, he said, is an open door through which heresy walks. He replaced the hesitant with zealots, men who saw no difference between justice and obedience. Within a year, Torquemada's network spanned the entire peninsula. Over 2,000 officials, priests, scribes, and soldiers answered his call. They moved like shadows through villages and cities, leaving fear in their wake. He introduced the Edict of Grace, a terrifying paradox. Townspeople were summoned to confess their heresies voluntarily within 30 days. If they did, they might be spared. But to confess meant to name others, to feed the machine. Those who remained silent were presumed guilty when the grace period ended. Under this system, no one was innocent, only unconfessed. From his seat in Avila, Torquemada ruled not with armies, but with parchment. Every letter that crossed his desk carried the fate of families. He spent his days surrounded by scrolls, seals, and reports, a scholar of damnation. Witnesses describe his chambers as austere, a single wooden cross, a desk, and piles of documents bound in black ribbon. He never smiled, never laughed. His meals were simple, bread, water, and the occasional fig. Yet outside his door, prisoners screamed, and fires consumed the condemned. He prayed as they burned. Lord, he was said to murmur, receive these souls purified by flame. To him, the pyre was not cruelty, it was ceremony. The flames rose like incense, carrying sins heavenward. The cries of the dying were prayers made flesh. In 1486, the Inquisition held one of its grandest autos da fe, or acts of faith, in Toledo. It was both trial and spectacle, judgment and entertainment. Torquemada himself presided. He sat beneath a crimson canopy, his robes immaculate, his face unreadable. Before him, 750 prisoners were brought forth, dressed in the San Benito, the yellow penitential robe marked with crosses and flames. The crowd filled the plaza, nobles, merchants, peasants, even children. Each name was read aloud. Some were sentenced to imprisonment, others to public penance. But for 23, the sentence was death by fire. When the flames rose, Torquemada did not look away. He held a silver crucifix aloft and whispered, "As their bodies burn, may their souls be freed." Those who stood near him swore they saw no emotion, no triumph, no pity, only conviction. The city smelled of ash for days. The power Torquemada wielded was intoxicating, not to him, but to those beneath him. His name alone carried more authority than the king's seal. When inquisitors arrived in a new town, they began their sermons with his blessing, invoking him as both judge and prophet. The people, too, began to see him as something beyond human, a saint to some, a demon to others. Mothers frightened their children into obedience by whispering, "Torquemada will come for you." And yet, he believed himself misunderstood. In letters to Isabella, he insisted that every act of cruelty was an act of love. "We must cut away the rot," he wrote, "lest the whole body perish." It was the language of every tyrant who ever believed his sins to be holy. But not all agreed with his vision. Even within the church, murmurs grew. Some bishops feared that the Inquisition's excesses would drive people away from faith entirely. Others whispered that Torquemada's zeal had crossed into madness. Reports reached Rome. Pope Innocent VIII wrote letters urging moderation, but Torquemada ignored them. He reminded the crown that the Inquisition was a Spanish institution, not a papal one. Spain was to be purified by its own hand. He wielded nationalism as his shield and faith as his sword, and so his authority only grew. The cruelty of his reign reached its peak in 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed west, carrying the promise of a new world, and Torquemada signed the decree that banished tens of thousands from the old one. The Edict of Expulsion forced all Jews to convert or leave Spain within 4 months. Families who had lived in Iberia for generations were stripped of their homes, their gold, their names. Some fled to Portugal, others to North Africa or the Ottoman Empire. Those who stayed and pretended conversion, the conversos, remained under Torquemada's eye.
It is said that when some nobleman pleaded for mercy, offering gold to allow the Jews to remain, Torquemada stormed into the royal court holding a crucifix high. He laid it before the monarchs and shouted, "Judas sold his master for 30 pieces of silver. Will you sell him again for more?" Ferdinand and Isabella bowed their heads. The expulsion went forward. By the year's end, Spain was rid of its Jewish population and stripped of some of its greatest minds, physicians, and financiers. The kingdom grew poorer in soul and spirit, but richer in orthodoxy. Torquemada retired a few years later to the monastery of St. Thomas in Avila. He was ill, his body frail,
his hands trembling from years of writing judgments. Yet even in retreat, he ruled through letters. His successor, Deza, followed his model, merciless, methodical, unyielding. Visitors to the monastery wrote that the Grand Inquisitor lived surrounded by silence. He spent his final days in prayer, still convinced that his cruelty had saved Spain's soul. When he died in 1498, the bells tolled for hours. His body was placed in a marble tomb, surrounded by carved angels. But history was not kind. When the Enlightenment dawned centuries later, his tomb was desecrated. Protesters smashed it to pieces, scattering his remains. The inscription once carved above his grave, "Defender of the Faith," was erased forever. And yet the shadow of Torquemada endures. His name became a symbol, not of religion, but of how absolute power, cloaked in righteousness, can turn a man into a monster. In the centuries that followed, writers, philosophers, and even popes would use his legacy as a warning. Voltaire wrote, "If Torquemada had lived in my time, he would have burned me first." But perhaps the most haunting reflection comes not from those who opposed him, but from one of his own scribes, who left behind a single line in a private note. He believed himself the hand of God, but in truth he was only man, and the fire he lit will never go out. Picture, if you will, the Grand Inquisitor's chamber at dusk, the flicker of a single candle, the scratch of his quill across parchment, the faint cry of a prisoner echoing up from the cells below. His face is calm, his lips move in prayer. To him, this is not cruelty, it is duty. The robe he wears is black not just in color, but in purpose. It hides the blood it has blessed. And so ends the tale of the man who turned faith into a machine that devoured a nation's soul.
The sun was setting over the stone walls of Toledo, its golden light spilling through narrow windows and dying at the threshold of the fortress. Beyond that light, down a stairway slick with centuries of damp air, lay the darkness that Spain tried never to name aloud. The chambers below. There was no choir here, no hymn, no sermon. Only the echo of chains and the whispered prayers of those who waited for dawn that would never come. This was where the Spanish Inquisition did its most holy work, where truth was torn from the body piece by piece. The Inquisitors called it interrogatio per tormenta, interrogation through torment. But the prisoners had another name for it, hell on earth. The chambers were small and windowless, carved deep into the stone foundations of monasteries and fortresses. The air was thick with the smell of mold, sweat, and old wax. Torches hissed against damp walls. In one corner stood a table covered in instruments, some of wood, others of iron, their edges glinting in the flickering light. Each tool had a name, each name a purpose, each purpose sanctified by faith. To the Inquisitors, these were not weapons, but instruments of salvation. The flesh must suffer, they would say, so the soul may be cleansed. And so, with rosary in hand and crucifix at their side, they began their work. The potro, or rack, was the oldest and most feared. It was deceptively simple, a wooden frame with ropes attached to rollers at either end. The accused was tied hand and foot, and as the inquisitor gave the order, the executioner turned the handle. Slowly, almost gently at first, the ropes tightened, pulling the body taut. Then the joints began to crack. The prisoner would gasp, then scream, then beg. Between each turn, the inquisitor asked questions, calm, polite, as though conducting confession. Do you deny lighting the Sabbath candles?
Do you persist in denying the church? Do you renounce your heresy? Each denial brought another turn. Each turn stretched the limbs closer to tearing.
It was said that the human body could withstand 3 turns before dislocation. But faith, the inquisitors believed, could endure far more. When the prisoner fainted, the questioning paused. Water was poured over the face to revive them, and the cycle began again. Confession was inevitable. Not truth, only surrender. Then there was la toca, the water torture. The accused was strapped to a board, tilted so their head lay lower than their feet. A cloth was placed over the mouth and nose, and water poured slowly upon it. The sensation was drowning. The body convulsed, lungs screamed for air, and the mind shattered in panic. Yet not a drop of blood was spilled. The inquisitors took pride in this. They recorded each session as proof of their restraint. "We use no violence," they wrote, "only persuasion." But persuasion, in the chambers below, was a word soaked in screams. Another device, favored for its simplicity, was the garrucha, the strappado. A rope was tied to the prisoner's wrists and thrown over a pulley fixed to the ceiling. The victim was hoisted until their toes barely touched the ground, then dropped suddenly. The arms wrenched backward, shoulders tearing from their sockets with a dull, wet pop. The inquisitor would step closer, holding a candle near the prisoner's face. "Confess," he would whisper, "and the pain will stop. God forgives those who tell the truth." And in that moment, broken bodies often gave up anything. Names, lies, prayers, whatever would end the agony. It did not matter if it was true, only that it was written. The most horrifying aspect of these sessions was their formality. Torture was not chaos, it was ritual. Each act was recorded by a scribe, seated quietly in the corner with ink and quill. He documented every cry, every question, every answer in precise Latin. The inquisitor, draped in robes of black, would pause between tortures to consult the record. "He persists in denial," he would note, then continue. Prayers were spoken before and after each session. The inquisitor would bless the room, cross himself, and thank God for giving him the strength to fight evil. Sometimes, after a confession, both inquisitor and executioner would kneel beside the half-conscious victim and pray for their soul. Then they would leave the chamber, step into the cool night, and sleep soundly. For them, it was not murder, it was ministry.
Stories from those who survived are rare, but they exist. Fragile testimonies written in exile years later. One such account came from a man named Miguel Sanchez, a merchant from Valencia accused of secretly practicing Judaism. His record, preserved in the archives of Lisbon, describes his ordeal. "They took me to a chamber where I saw ropes, a wheel, and a trough of water. The friars spoke gently, saying they loved me as a brother and wished to save me. I told them I was faithful to Christ. They smiled. Then they stripped me. When I would not confess, they placed me on the board and poured water till I could no longer breathe. They said the devil was leaving me through my mouth. When I awoke,
I confessed to what they wished. I cannot recall what I said, only that it was not true. Miguel was sentenced to wear the San Benito and paraded through the streets before being exiled. He died in Portugal, his back still scarred from the ropes. His story was one among thousands, voices drowned by the roar of faith. The inquisitors themselves rarely questioned their duty. Many were learned men, trained in theology and law. They quoted Augustine and Aquinas to justify pain. Error has no rights, they said. Mercy to the sinner is cruelty to the faithful. But not all hearts were made of stone. Some broke under the weight of their calling. Father Rodrigo de Tapia, an inquisitor in Valladolid, kept a secret journal later found hidden in a false wall. In one entry he wrote, "I have seen men confess to sins they could not name, women pray for death, children cry for mothers who will not return. We say this is the work of God, but I fear we have built a God of our own making, one that feeds on fear and calls it faith." Weeks later, Father Rodrigo vanished. His name was never mentioned again. The chambers were not limited to Spain. As the Inquisition spread to the colonies and beyond, its tools followed, to the Americas, to Sicily, to the Netherlands. The same rope, the same rack, the same questions asked in the same calm tone. The same prayers whispered before the screams began. In every city where the Inquisition ruled, there was a place below ground that no one spoke of, a place where truth had no meaning. The cruelty of the chambers was not in their design, but in their purpose. Torture was never about confession, it was about obedience. The inquisitors knew that pain could produce words, but not truth. Yet words were all they needed. Once spoken, those words became evidence. Once written, they became history. A man might deny his confession later, but the record would not. Thus, the chamber below became the engine that powered the entire system. The rack did not break bodies alone. It broke generations. Families were ruined, wealth confiscated, reputations erased. The survivors carried silence like a second skin.
Even after death, the Inquisition pursued them. Their bones could be exhumed, their ashes condemned, their descendants forced to prove purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, for centuries. The torture never truly ended. It simply changed form. Inquisitors believed themselves untouchable, yet occasionally a whisper of revolt escaped the chambers. In 1506, a friar named Andrés in Granada refused to participate in another interrogation. He told his superior, "If Christ himself were chained before me, I would not raise the lever." He was accused of sympathy for heretics. Within a month, he was gone, replaced by another, more obedient servant. The machine continued to turn. Imagine now the chamber at night. The torches flicker, casting long shadows over the instruments. The rack stands empty, ropes still damp with sweat. The air hums faintly with the memory of screams. A priest kneels before the crucifix, whispering prayers. To him, this is victory, another soul reclaimed, another enemy of the church silenced. Yet somewhere, deep within his heart, a question stirs. If this is God's will, why does it feel like murder? He will not speak it aloud. The walls here have ears. By the dawn of the 16th century, Thousands had passed through the chambers below. Some emerged broken, some dead, some reborn into obedience. Spain was unified, the monarchs triumphant, and the Inquisition hailed as the defender of faith. But beneath the cathedrals, the stones remembered. They had absorbed centuries of screams, soaked in the tears of the penitent, the defiant, the innocent. Those stones still whisper even now, if you stand close enough, not of glory, but of agony sanctified. And so, as the sun rises again over Toledo, its light never touches those rooms. They remain buried beneath the weight of time, beneath the prayers of those who believed that pain could purify the soul. The chamber below is gone, yet it lives on in every place where fear is called righteousness, where confession is forced, and where silence becomes survival. The city of Valladolid awoke to the toll of church bells. The air smelled of rain, but in the plaza the earth was dry, scorched by fires from the week before. Beneath the cathedral shadow, the Inquisition prepared for another day of judgment. Not far away, inside the tribunal, rows of wooden benches stood beneath the vaulted ceiling. Candles flickered, illuminating the crucifix at the far end. Behind a heavy table sat 3 inquisitors, their faces pale in the dim light. The largest among them tapped his fingers on a parchment. Beside him, a scribe sharpened his quill. The accused was brought in. He was not a noble, nor a scholar, only a cobbler named Martín Herrera, a man who had once prayed every morning, who had baptized his children, and who now stood barefoot and trembling before the court of faith. His crime? Not eating pork.
That was how it often began, not with rebellion, but with routine. A neighbor had reported that Martín's family avoided pork on Sundays. Another claimed he muttered prayers in a foreign tongue. A child, perhaps, had overheard him speak kindly of an old friend who had converted years ago. It was enough. Under the Inquisition, faith was not proven by devotion, but by conformity. To eat pork was to prove Christian loyalty. To hesitate was to invite suspicion. So Martín stood accused, not because of what he had done, but because of what others feared he might be. The trial began with ritual. The inquisitors rose and chanted a prayer. They crossed themselves, then commanded Martín to swear upon the Holy Bible to tell the truth, even though he did not yet know what he was accused of. "Do you deny the charges?" one asked. "I do," Martín said softly. Then the inquisitor replied, "You deny your own salvation." The Inquisition's trials were unlike any other. There was no open defense, no lawyer, no public witness. The accused never saw their accusers, nor the evidence against them. Everything was secret, for their own good, it was said. The Inquisitioners followed a strict order: accusation, examination, confession, sentencing. But beneath that structure lay chaos, rumors, jealousy, and fear woven into the machinery of law. An accusation might come from anyone: a servant, a rival, a priest. Often the motive was personal. A slighted neighbor, a business dispute, or envy over an inheritance could all be turned into heresy. Once accused, a person's fate was sealed. The tribunal rarely acquitted. To question the charge was to question the church. Thus, innocence itself became heresy. The courtroom was a theater of control. The inquisitors sat high, draped in black. Before them, the accused knelt. A clerk read aloud the charges, his voice steady, detached. "You are accused of blasphemy,
of secret Judaism, of denying the saints, and of false confession. The list was endless. Most accused were guilty of none. Yet as the words echoed through the hall, the crowd outside, those allowed to attend, nodded solemnly. They had seen this before. They knew how it ended. Martín, like many, tried to defend himself. He spoke of his devotion, his prayers, his attendance at Mass. But each defense was twisted into guilt. You claim to be devout? Yes. Then why do others say you mock the Church? I never have. Ah, so you accuse your neighbors of lying. Is that Christian humility? There was no answer that could save him.
Every trial had a script, even if the actors changed. After the first questioning came the examination of witnesses. Anonymous voices read from scrolls. Their words carried the weight of stone. One said he saw Martin turn his back during the elevation of the host. Another claimed he failed to cross himself properly. A third insisted he heard him mutter in Hebrew. None of it could be verified. All of it was believed. The inquisitors recorded every detail, nodding gravely. Their pens moved swiftly across parchment. They were not seeking truth. They were crafting it. Days turned to weeks. Martín was kept in a cell with no window, only a small hole for food and confession. Each day, he was told to reflect on his sins. Each night, he was awakened for prayer. Sleep deprivation was a quieter form of torture, but no less effective. By the 10th day, he began to doubt himself. Perhaps he had said something wrong. Perhaps, without realizing, he had sinned. That was the true genius of the Inquisition. It made the innocent believe in their guilt. When the interrogations resumed, Martín confessed, not because he was guilty, but because he could no longer endure the waiting. He admitted to speaking with a man of Jewish blood years ago, to lighting a candle once at dusk, to forgetting a prayer in Latin. The inquisitors smiled. They had their confession. The trial moved swiftly after that. In a grand ceremony called the auto de fe, Martín and dozens of others were paraded through the streets in San Benito's, the yellow penitential robes painted with flames and demons. Crowds gathered, chanting hymns as the condemned passed. Children threw flowers, not out of joy, but ritual. The offering of innocence to the machinery of faith. In the plaza, a sermon was preached on the dangers of heresy. See before you those who turn from the light. Let their punishment be your salvation. The condemned were separated, some to imprisonment, others to fire. Martín was spared the flames. He was sentenced to public humiliation and the loss of his property. His family would live in shame, branded by his sin. He survived, but his life was over. This pattern repeated across Spain. Town by town, the trials became part of daily life. Inquisitors traveled with their scribes and soldiers, setting up temporary tribunals in churches or castles. Edicts were read aloud from pulpits. All who knew of heresy must report it or face excommunication.
The faithful obeyed. People turned in friends, lovers, even family. One mother in Córdoba denounced her son after finding him reading a book in Latin she did not understand. Another man accused his wife of witchcraft because her bread never rose. Each name given bought the accuser safety for a time. But the wheel turned endlessly. Today's accuser might be tomorrow's heretic. The trials were not only spiritual, they were political. Wealthy merchants and conversos, those who had converted from Judaism or Islam, were prime targets. Their assets were confiscated for the glory of God and the crown. Whole fortunes changed hands under the seal of faith. One letter from a royal official to the Inquisition read, "The property of the heretics shall be divided, 1/3 for the tribunal, 1/3 for the church, and 1/3 for His Majesty." In truth, greed fueled salvation as much as belief. The Inquisition was a machine of profit, powered by human souls. Even as the fires burned, some resisted. A young scholar named Luis Vives, whose parents had been condemned, wrote later in exile, "They call it a trial, but it is not law. It is theater. They call it confession, but it is not truth. It is terror. They call it faith, but it is fear wearing a cross." His words would not be read in Spain for centuries. For every Martín Herrera, there were countless others, nameless farmers, widows, artisans, and nuns. Their only crime was difference. The Inquisition's trials were mirrors in which Spain saw not heretics, but herself, fractured, frightened, desperate to believe she was pure. And so the trials continued. Each sentence proclaimed purity, each execution deepened the stain. By the early 1500s, entire generations had been raised under the shadow of judgment. Children learned that salvation was survival, that to speak was danger, that to be silent was divine. The bells that once called people to worship now called them to witness punishment.
Imagine the tribunal as it stood on its final night of session. The inquisitors extinguished their candles, sealing the confessions in wax. Outside, the plaza lies empty, smoke from the pyres drifting into the stars. Tomorrow, another town, another name, another trial. The Inquisition never needed armies to conquer Spain. It conquered with parchment and prayer, with whispers and fear. And in that victory, it proved a truth more terrible than heresy, that when power dresses in the robes of faith, justice no longer needs evidence, only belief. The morning sun rose over the plaza of Seville, glinting off banners of red and gold. The square was alive with anticipation, a day of spectacle, a day of purification. Merchants closed their stalls, bells rang from every tower, and children clambered onto rooftops to see the stage being built. They called it the auto da fe, the act of faith. But what unfolded in those burning squares was not faith, it was theater. The Inquisition understood the human heart better than any monarch. They knew that power does not thrive in shadows alone. It must be displayed. And so torture chambers may have been hidden, but executions were not. The same church that whispered in confession now roared in public, its flames rising toward heaven. At dawn, the prisoners were brought from their cells, pale and trembling. Each was dressed in the Sanbenito, a yellow robe painted with black crosses and symbols of their sins. On some, flames were drawn to mark the sentence of death. They were paraded through the streets, led by Dominican friars chanting psalms. Behind them came soldiers with spears, and before them, the crucifix.
because, as the inquisitors said, the condemned must walk beneath the shadow of salvation before meeting judgment. The crowd parted as they passed. Some crossed themselves, others wept, others shouted curses. But all watched. The Inquisition made sure of that. Attendance was not merely allowed, it was expected. To stay home was to invite suspicion. To avert your eyes was to seem sympathetic. And so the entire city came, drawn by fear, disguised as faith. In Seville, the platform stood at the center of the square, a grand wooden scaffold draped in black cloth, adorned with the emblems of the crown and the cross. Rows of chairs were arranged for the clergy and nobility. The king's representatives sat closest to the front, their armor gleaming like polished mirrors. A great banner hung above the stage, embroidered in Latin. E sarcerica prom domine et judicath causam tuam.
Before the executions began, the day opened with a mass, the Missa pro defunctis, a prayer for the souls of the soon-to-be dead. The choir sang softly, their voices echoing through the morning air, mingling with the creak of wood and the murmurs of the crowd. Then came the sermon, long, thunderous, and sanctified. The preacher spoke of purity, of obedience, of the danger of heresy. He pointed to the condemned and declared, "These are the lost sheep, who turned from the shepherd's path. But today, through holy fire, they shall return to his fold." The people cheered. It was not cruelty they saw. It was salvation in action. Fire to them was not death, but cleansing. The soul, they believed, was purified as the body burned. But for the condemned, the fire was neither holy nor merciful. Among those standing that day was a woman named Catalina Perez, a midwife accused of witchcraft. She had helped deliver countless children in her village, using herbs and prayers passed down through generations. When a noble's infant died in her arms, the mother, consumed by grief, whispered the word bruja. That word was enough. Now Catalina stood before thousands, her face streaked with tears, her hands bound. A friar approached and held a crucifix before her lips. "Confess," he said softly, "and God may forgive you." She met his eyes. "I have nothing to confess," she replied. The friar sighed. "Then you confess your pride." Moments later, she was led to the stake. The executioners worked methodically. Chains were fastened around Catalina's waist and ankles. Beneath her, bundles of wood were stacked carefully, olive branches chosen for their slow burn. A friar offered her one last chance to repent. She whispered a prayer, not in Latin, but in her own tongue, for her children, not her judges. The signal was given. Torches touched the base of the pyre. Smoke rose first, thin, gray, curling upward like a ghost. Then the flames caught, licking her robes, turning yellow to gold. The crowd gasped as fire roared to life. Some crossed themselves, others wept. A few shouted, "Gloria Deo," glory to God. The friars chanted hymns to drown out her screams. The air filled with the mingled sound of fire, song, and agony. The holy symphony of the Inquisition.
To watch was to believe. That was the purpose of the auto da fe. It was not simply execution, it was ritual. Each act of burning was choreographed, each word measured. The condemned were positioned facing the church so their final sight would be the cross. The inquisitors stood above them, reciting prayers as smoke blurred the sky. When the flames finally died, the ashes were swept away and scattered in secret, so no heretics' remains could be honored. Their names were carved into no stone, their families forbidden to mourn. But the smell of smoke lingered long after the hymns faded. The auto da fe were held not only in Seville, but across Spain, Toledo, Córdoba, Valencia, and Madrid. Each city competed for grandeur. The larger the crowd, the greater the show of devotion. In Madrid, the square could hold 10,000. Nobles arrived in carriages, their silks and jewels glimmering beside the gallows. Artists were hired to paint scenes of the event, not as horror, but as triumph. For the Inquisition, it was public relations. For the people, it was religion made visible. The line between faith and spectacle vanished in the smoke. Even the children were not spared from the ritual. They were taught to pray for the souls of the heretics, to thank God for the purity of Spain. Schoolmasters took them to the plazas, telling them, "Remember this, for it is what happens to those who stray." Generations grew up believing that holiness required fire. One chronicler, an Italian visitor named Giovanni Rinaldi, witnessed the auto da fe in Valladolid in 1509. His writings survive. It was like a festival. There were banners, music, and soldiers in bright armor. The condemned walked barefoot, some crying, others silent. I saw one young man smile as the flames reached him, saying, "Christ forgives me." The crowd gasped, not in pity, but in awe. They believed they had seen a miracle. Never have I known a people who celebrate death so beautifully. Rinaldi left Spain soon after, calling it a country where faith has no mercy. Behind the grandeur, the Inquisition kept careful count. Every execution was documented: name, age, crime, confession, and final words. These records, bound in leather, filled entire libraries. To the inquisitors, these were trophies, proof of duty fulfilled. One entry, preserved in the archives of Salamanca, reads simply, "Catalina Pérez, midwife, obstinate in error, delivered to the secular arm, expired without repentance. Deo gratias. Thanks be to God."
Over time, even the condemned began to understand their role in this theater. Some went to the stake chanting hymns, defying their judges with faith of their own. Others kissed the cross as the flames rose. Their courage terrified the inquisitors, for it revealed a truth too dangerous to admit, that the fire could not kill belief. Still, the flames burned. For the Inquisition, there was no such thing as enough. Each pyre demanded another. Each confession proved the necessity of more confessions. Faith fed on fire, and fire fed on fear. As centuries passed, the auto da fe became legend, retold in songs, painted in frescoes, recorded in whispers. The Church would later call it a misunderstanding of zeal, a mistake of history. But in the plazas of old Spain, the smoke told another story. For every pyre that rose, another shadow fell across the land. The people forgot the names of those who burned, but the fear remained, a quiet voice in every heart whispering, "Obey." Now, if you walk through the old squares of Seville or Valladolid at dusk, you may still hear it. The faint creak of wood, the murmur of unseen prayers, the echo of a crowd long gone. The stones themselves seem to remember. No monument stands for the burned, no plaque marks the ashes. Only the air holds their memory, and it smells faintly of smoke. The chamber was silent, except for the drip of water. A single candle flickered beside the crucifix, its flame trembling with every breath of damp air. Before the inquisitor knelt a man in rags, his hands bound, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He had already screamed, already begged, already bled. Now
He was being asked the most important question of all. Do you confess? The inquisitor's voice was calm, almost tender, as though he were offering salvation rather than demanding surrender. The man hesitated, and the inquisitor sighed. My son, you have suffered much, but suffering without repentance is meaningless. Confess, and God will forgive. The prisoner's lips trembled. If I confess, he whispered, will it stop? The inquisitor smiled. If you confess, you will be saved. And so another confession was born, not of guilt, but of exhaustion. In the Spanish Inquisition, confession was not a path to redemption, it was currency, the coin by which the innocent bought survival and the guilty bought mercy.
By the late 15th century, confession had become the engine that powered the Inquisition. Torture, imprisonment, and trial all led to this single goal: to make a soul speak. A confession was proof of success, both spiritual and political. It justified the tribunal's existence, filled its archives, and sanctified its cruelty. Every signed document became a triumph, another victory for faith, another soul saved. But confession also served a darker purpose. The Inquisition's survival depended on its ability to produce heretics. Without them, the institution would lose funding, influence, and purpose. Thus, confession was not merely desired, it was required. If one refused to confess, it was seen as defiance of God. If one confessed, it was evidence of guilt. There was no path that did not lead to condemnation. Inside the tribunals, the process followed a ritual precision. The inquisitor would begin gently, speaking of mercy. We are not your enemies. We are shepherds of the soul. Tell the truth, and you will be forgiven. If the prisoner resisted, the tone changed. Your silence is rebellion. Only the guilty deny the light. Then came the threats, the mention of the potro, or the toca, the rack, or the water torture. The accused had heard the screams from the chamber below. They knew what came next. Most confessed before the ropes were even tied. The inquisitor would nod approvingly, whisper a prayer, and signal the scribe to write. Confess fully, so that your soul may be cleansed. And so the prisoner spoke, not truth, but survival. But confession was not enough. The Inquisition demanded details, names of others, dates, meetings, words whispered in the dark. Each confession had to breed more confessions, or it was useless. Thus, the accused became the Inquisition's most efficient weapon. Under pressure, they named neighbors, friends, even family. Some did it to end the pain, others to prove devotion. I have sinned, they would cry, and so have they. The inquisitors recorded everything. Entire communities were built upon layers of accusation, each confession weaving a larger web of fear. It was the perfect system, a self-replicating chain of guilt that fed upon itself.
The archives of Toledo hold a record from 1491, the confession of Francisco de Luna, a silversmith accused of heresy. His written statement, signed with a trembling hand, reads, I, Francisco, confess to praying in the tongue of my fathers. I confess to not eating pork upon the Sabbath. I confess to lighting candles in secret. I confess that my brother and my neighbor Juan were with me. Francisco was executed. His brother and neighbor were arrested within the week. From one confession came 3 new trials. Even those who confessed and repented could not escape. Repentance did not mean release, it meant ownership. Once a person confessed, The Inquisition owned their soul. They could be summoned again and again for further questioning. They could be forced to wear the San Benito in public, marked forever as a penitent. Those who repented were forbidden from holding office, trading freely, or marrying without approval. They lived as ghosts among the living, reminders of the Inquisition's reach. The Church called this mercy. To the people, it was life in slow motion, a living death granted by confession. For the Inquisitors, confession was also a form of currency with the crown. Every confession justified funding, property seizures, and new tribunals. When the Grand Inquisitor Torquemada sent his annual reports to Ferdinand and Isabella, he included not only numbers of executions, but lists of confessions. It was proof that Spain was being purified. In one letter, Torquemada wrote, "The harvest is plentiful, though the field is sinful. Each soul returned to the faith is another jewel in His Majesty's crown." For every confession recorded, a family's wealth was confiscated for the good of the Church. Confession became profitable. A heretic's repentance might save their soul, but it enriched the Inquisition. The confessional chamber itself became a stage of manipulation. Priests and inquisitors learned to read faces, to sense weakness, to strike precisely where faith and fear met. They spoke of forgiveness, but their words were calculated to break resolve. One might say, "My son, the devil deceives you into silence. Confess, and you will feel peace." Or, "Do you not love your mother? If she saw you refuse God, would she not weep for your soul?" It was not torture of the body, but of the conscience, a slow erosion of certainty until guilt became truth.
And when the final confession was written, the inquisitor would nod solemnly and whisper, "At last you are free. Free to burn." Not all confessors broke under pain. Some confessed out of faith, twisted faith, born of terror. They believed that confession, even false, was better than silence, that God would understand, that their lives would be forgiven after death. A woman named Inés de Montiel, condemned in Granada in 1502, said before her execution, "I lied to them, but I lied for God. Better to die as a sinner in His sight than to be tortured in theirs." Her words never reached the Inquisitor's records, but the friar who witnessed her death wrote them secretly in his diary. She went to the flames smiling, as though she had tricked the devil himself. Over time, confession infected every corner of life in Spain. Children were taught to confess every thought. Wives confessed their husbands' words. Priests encouraged confession not only of sin, but of suspicion. The line between spiritual purity and political loyalty vanished. To confess became an act of patriotism. To remain silent was treason. The Church and Crown were now one, and both fed upon confession. But what happens when confession loses its meaning? When every word spoken is coerced? When truth and lie blur into one? The Inquisition never asked that question. Yet Spain itself began to answer it. As centuries passed, distrust became a national wound. Neighbors no longer trusted neighbors. Children no longer trusted parents. A society built on confession forgot how to speak honestly. Even the inquisitors began to feel the rot. One unnamed scribe wrote in the margin of a record, "We make liars of all men and call it truth." His note was scratched out by another hand, but the ink remains faintly visible. The psychology of confession was more powerful than any rack or flame. It turned faith into weapon, guilt into currency, and fear into obedience. It transformed the Church from a house of prayer into an empire of surveillance, where every soul was a debtor, and every priest a collector. In that system, even silence had value, because it demanded to be broken. And so the Inquisition continued to ask the same question, generation after generation, with the same calm voice and the same promise of mercy. Do you confess? And millions answered, again and again, until their words lost meaning, and only echoes remained. If you stand today in the old monasteries of Spain, in the places once called tribunals, you can still feel it. The heavy air of guilt, the faint scent of wax and parchment. The walls seem to whisper, as though the confessions were never truly silenced. You can almost hear it, faintly, just below the surface of time. The voice of an inquisitor, gentle and relentless. Confess, my child, for confession is the key to freedom. And somewhere in the darkness, a voice answers, weary, trembling, and eternal. Yes, Father, I confess. The night air in Toledo was still, heavy with the scent of olive smoke and rain. In a small stone house near the city gates, a woman sat by the glow of a single candle. Her hands were rough from years of labor, yet gentle as she crushed herbs in a mortar. On the table lay a newborn child, wrapped in linen, breathing softly. The woman whispered a prayer, not in Latin, but in the old tongue of her mother. Outside, footsteps echoed in the street. She froze. The candle flickered. A knock sounded at the door. Open in the name of the Holy Office. Her name was Lucia Morales, a midwife, and before sunrise, she would be taken away. Her crime was not witchcraft, not sorcery, not rebellion. Her crime was knowledge, and the sin of being a woman who healed without permission. By the end of the 15th century, the Spanish Inquisition had turned its gaze toward women. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with whispers and rumors. The Church had long feared women who held power beyond the altar, women who birthed children, cured illness, or spoke of dreams. Their wisdom was older than the Church itself, passed down through generations of midwives and healers. The Inquisition called it heresy by nature. To them, a woman who healed without clerical approval was meddling in divine design. A woman who used herbs instead of prayer was invoking the devil. A woman who knew too much about the body, the moon, or the mysteries of life was a threat. And so the women who once held Spain's most sacred role, the guardians of birth, the keepers of the hearth, became its most hunted.
Lucia was one of many. For years she had served the poor of Toledo. When priests refused to visit plague-stricken homes, she went. When mothers labored through the night, she came. She carried bundles of herbs, jars of oil, and prayers whispered in secret. But one winter, the child of a wealthy noblewoman died during birth. Grief turned to blame, and blame to accusation. She invoked dark forces, the mother said. She murmured strange words. She would not let the priest enter. Within days, Lucia's name was written into the Inquisition's register. When the soldiers came, she did not resist. She only asked if she could finish her prayer. They allowed it, and then they bound her hands. The prison smelled of rot and old incense. Lucia was thrown into a cell beside two others, a washerwoman accused of blasphemy, and a girl of 16 accused of visions. For weeks she was questioned. Who taught you the herbs? My mother. And who taught her? Her mother before her. Then your family has practiced forbidden arts for generations. Lucia shook her head. "We only healed the sick." The inquisitor smiled faintly. "And who gave you the power to heal, if not God?" "God," she said. "Then why do you need herbs?" There was no answer that could save her. Women like Lucia filled the Inquisition's prisons: healers, midwives, widows, beggars, poets. They were accused not only of witchcraft, but of pride, of knowing things a woman was not meant to know. The Church saw women as vessels of temptation, their minds fragile, their souls vulnerable to the devil's whispers. Eve brought sin into the world, and her daughters bring it still. To question a woman's wisdom was to preserve divine order. To punish her was to protect the faith. The Inquisition called this mercy. In Salamanca, an elderly woman named Teresa de Avilés was accused after she cured a child's fever with herbs instead of holy water. The child lived, but word spread that the cure came from witchcraft. During her trial, Teresa said calmly, "If healing is sin, then I am guilty." The inquisitors recorded her words and sentenced her to public penance. But when she refused to recant, she was sent to the flames. Witnesses wrote that she walked to the stake without fear, murmuring prayers not to God, but to the Mother of the earth. The crowd gasped as the flames rose, for she did not scream. Later, the Inquisition declared her soul purified by fire. Not all were burned. Some were broken more slowly. Those who confessed were forced to wear the San Benito and paraded through their towns. Others were whipped in public squares or exiled. Their homes were seized, their daughters shunned, their names erased from parish records. In one town, a priest wrote that no midwife could assist a birth without a license from the church. Those who did were considered suspect. The ancient bond between women, of knowledge shared in whispers, was shattered. In its place, fear took root. Mothers now prayed before every birth, not only for the child's life, but for their own, that their midwife would not be accused, that the crying of the newborn would drown out the whispers of neighbors. Yet even as the flames rose higher, the stories of these women survived, carried in secret, written in margins, remembered in lullabies. One tale tells of Beatriz de la Vega, a healer from Aragon, who was said to bless her herbs by moonlight. When the Inquisition came for her, she scattered her remedies into the river, saying, "Let the water carry what the fire cannot destroy." No one knows what became of her, but for centuries after, villagers swore that the herbs still grew along that riverbank, glowing faintly on nights when the moon was full. To the inquisitors, these women were heretics. To the people, they were something else. Symbols of courage in an age of silence. In secret, many continued their work. They disguised their herbs as holy relics, their cures as miracles. Some joined convents to hide their practice behind the veil. Others taught their daughters under the guise of prayer. They became ghosts in simple sight, healers without names, mothers without graves. The Church's war against women was not limited to the accused. It reshaped the very idea of womanhood. Obedience became virtue. Silence became holiness. A woman's value lay not in her knowledge, but in her submission. Priests preached that the tongue of woman is the devil's rope. Confession became control. The body became shame. Generations grew up believing that to be good was to be afraid. Yet history has a way of remembering what the fire tries to erase. In modern Spain, ruins of old Inquisition prisons still stand, their walls etched with faint carvings of flowers,
moons, and names. Historians believe many were drawn by imprisoned women, scratching their identity into stone before the flames took them. One inscription, found in a cell in Saragossa, reads, "I am Lucia. I brought life into the world. They bring death. God will know the difference." Her name was never recorded in the Inquisition's archives, only her confession. But her words, carved in stone, endure. When we speak of the Spanish Inquisition, we often think of kings, priests, and grand inquisitors, men cloaked in authority. But beneath them lay the ashes of countless women, burned not for heresy, but for existing beyond the boundaries drawn by men. They were not witches. They were midwives, poets, healers, dreamers, the quiet architects of life. The fire that consumed them was meant to cleanse the world of their wisdom. Instead, it illuminated their courage. If you walk today through the old squares where they burned, the air feels different, soft, restless, alive. The wind carries whispers like sighs. Some say that on certain nights you can smell lavender and rosemary, though no plants grow there anymore. Perhaps it is memory. Perhaps it is defiance. Perhaps it is the scent of women who refused to be silenced. They were the women of fire. And though the flames devoured their bodies, their light never went out.
In a silent corridor beneath the great cathedral of Madrid, the air was cool and still. The candles burned low, their flames trembling against stone walls. At the end of the passage stood a heavy oak door, its iron hinges blackened by age. Behind that door lay one of the most secret rooms in Europe, the archives of the Holy Office. It was here, far from the noise of the streets and the cries of the condemned, that the Spanish Inquisition kept its truest power, not in torture or fire, but in ink. The chamber smelled of parchment, wax, and dust. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with leather-bound volumes, sealed letters, and rolls of parchment tied with red ribbon. Each document held a story, a name, a confession, a betrayal. Together, they formed the memory of an empire of fear. The inquisitors called these archives El Corazón del Santo Oficio, the heart of the Holy Office. They were not wrong. Every accusation, every whisper, every confession was written down, copied, and stored. From Sevilla to Zaragoza, from Granada to Madrid, couriers carried sealed packages marked with the emblem of the cross and sword. They contained the lifeblood of the Inquisition, information. Inside were reports from priests, letters from informants, and testimonies from trials. Each was carefully recorded by scribes sworn to secrecy. The records were coded, dated, and filed. A single accusation against a merchant in Valencia could travel across the country, reaching the hands of inquisitors hundreds of miles away. If his name appeared again in another document, even by rumor, it was marked. His fate was sealed long before he ever saw the inside of a tribunal. In time, the Inquisition's archives grew so vast that even the crown feared what they contained. For within those shelves lay the secrets of kings, bishops, and nobles, every sin confessed, every whisper overheard. Knowledge, the inquisitors understood, was the purest form of power. The men who kept these records were called notarios del secreto, notaries of the secret. They were scholars and clerks, chosen not for their faith, but for their silence. Each morning they descended into the archive chambers, carrying candles and ink. They worked in rows of narrow desks, transcribing testimonies and sealing them with wax. They spoke rarely, and when they did,
it was in whispers. Their hands trembled not from fear of God, but from fear of error. For a single mistake in record-keeping could mean death. One scribe, whose notes survived in the margins of a confiscated volume, wrote, "We do not write history, we erase it. We make it new each day in the image of the Church." He never signed his name.
The archives were not merely records, they were weapons. When a person was accused, the inquisitors would search the files for connections. Had their name appeared before? Had their family ever been questioned? Were they related to a known converso or morisco? The files created a network of suspicion, an invisible map linking lives, families, and generations. A farmer in Toledo might be arrested because his grandfather's name appeared in a trial record 50 years earlier. A scholar in Salamanca might lose his position because a forgotten confession mentioned his teacher's friend. The Inquisition never forgot. The archive remembered everything. Inside these walls, even time itself seemed to bow to the will of the inquisitors. Old records were revisited, copied, and reinterpreted. A confession written in one century could condemn someone in the next. The past was not history, it was evidence waiting to be used. In this way, the Inquisition turned memory into control. The written word, sanctified by the Church, became eternal judgment. It was said that Torquemada himself walked these archives by candlelight, reading reports long into the night. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were carved into policy. "Paper," he once said, "never dies. The tongue may lie, the body may fail, but the written word endures until judgment." And so he ordered that every document, even the smallest rumor, be preserved. He believed that in the written record, truth could not escape. He was wrong. The archives did not preserve truth. They preserved obedience. There are stories of those who tried to destroy them. In 1512, a group of monks in Valencia set fire to a storeroom containing thousands of trial records. The blaze burned for 3 days, the air thick with the scent of scorched parchment. The monks were caught and executed. Their act was called sacrilege, but to them it was salvation. One of the monks, before he died, said, "Better that lies burn than souls." The Inquisition rebuilt the archives, stronger than before. They learned to store their most important volumes in underground vaults sealed by both stone and faith. The crown, too, used the archives to its advantage. Kings and queens could request information from the Inquisition to deal with rivals. A noble suspected of disloyalty might find himself accused not of treason, but of heresy, a cleaner, holier death. Thus, the archives became a tool not just of faith, but of politics. In one notorious case, a duke who opposed royal taxation was suddenly accused of harboring Moorish sympathies. His name appeared in 3 separate reports, all conveniently written within the same week. The duke was executed, and his lands divided between the church and the crown. The archives made every execution legal, every theft holy. For the common people, the archives were a ghostly presence. They never saw them, but they knew their power. To be in the book was a death sentence. Rumors spread that the inquisitors could summon your name from a page like a curse, that your soul was bound to their ink. Parents warned their children, "Watch your words. The church writes everything." Even priests lived in fear of the files. Some begged forgiveness for mistakes that had never been recorded,
only imagined. The power of the archives lay not only in what they contained, but in what people believed they contained. It was faith weaponized into bureaucracy. In time, the Inquisition's record-keeping grew so vast that it required entire buildings. In Madrid, the headquarters, known as the Casa de la Inquisición, became a labyrinth of rooms filled with shelves, drawers, and secret compartments. Only the highest-ranking officials held keys. Within those walls, priests debated which confessions to release to the crown and which to hide. Some were too dangerous, confessions of bishops, of noblewomen, even of inquisitors themselves. And so the archives became both the Church's greatest treasure and its deepest wound. Centuries later, when Napoleon's troops invaded Spain, they broke into one of these archives. Soldiers opened chests and crates, spilling documents across the floor. The officers laughed as they read the ancient accusations. Juan of Córdoba, suspected of having eaten meat on Friday. Maria, daughter of Alonso, accused of smiling at Mass. But as they dug deeper, their laughter faded. They found reports of torture, confessions signed in blood, and letters from kings demanding silence. One French officer wrote in his diary, "We thought we would find history. Instead, we found horror." He ordered the vault sealed again.
Much of the Inquisition's record survives to this day. In dusty archives across Spain, in Seville, Madrid, Valencia, the old files still sit, fragile but intact. Historians who read them speak of a strange unease. Each page is precise, orderly, written in perfect Latin, and yet between the lines, there is something monstrous. There is no hatred, no anger, only method. The cruelty lies in the calmness of the ink. The Inquisition called its archives the heart of the faith, but perhaps it was more accurate to call them its memory of fear, a memory that could not be erased because it was written into the fabric of a nation. For centuries, those records were guarded more closely than relics. Even when the Inquisition was abolished in the 19th century, the Church refused to destroy them. Perhaps they feared what would happen if the truth finally vanished. Or perhaps they feared what would happen if it was read. Today, those who have studied the old records say the same thing. The Inquisition did not die when the fires went out. It endured on paper. Every file, every confession, every accusation was another thread in a vast web that spanned centuries. A web woven not with chains, but with words. In that silence of the archives, the ghosts of the accused still whisper, their names preserved by the very power that destroyed them. And if you listen closely, you might still hear the scratch of a quill across parchment, echoing through time, writing the same story over and over again. In the name of faith, in the service of truth, for the salvation of souls. The sun burned red above the towers of Madrid, gilding the royal palace in light that looked almost like fire. Inside its echoing halls, two worlds met, the sacred and the sovereign. On one side stood the throne of the crown, carved in gold. On the other, the cross of the Church, carved in stone. Between them, a thin line of shadow marked where power met faith. It was upon this line that Spain balanced for centuries. The Spanish Inquisition was not merely a religious tribunal. It was a political weapon
sharpened by kings and sanctified by priests. Faith had become the most effective form of control, and in the hands of those who understood its potential, it could rule an empire. This is the story of how the cross became a crown, and how God's will became a tool of kings.
When Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile married, they united two kingdoms divided by centuries of war, culture, and faith. Their goal was simple: to forge one Spain, one law, one ruler, and one belief. But unity cannot be forced by armies alone. It must be sanctified, made divine. The monarchs needed more than power. They needed legitimacy. And so they turned to the Church. The Pope's blessing gave their rule divine authority, but it was the Inquisition that gave them divine fear, the kind that made disobedience not only treason, but sin. The Inquisition was the Crown's invisible army. While soldiers fought rebels in Granada and explorers carried banners to the New World, inquisitors worked quietly at home, rooting out disloyalty. Heresy, after all, was not just religious error, it was political rebellion in disguise. A man who doubted the Church might someday doubt the king. A woman who questioned confession might someday question authority. Thus, faith and loyalty became the same thing. To believe was to obey. Torquemada understood this better than anyone. He was not simply the Grand Inquisitor, he was the architect of royal power cloaked in sanctity. In his letters to Queen Isabella, he wrote not of theology, but of empire. Your Majesty's realm is the body of Christ. Heresy is disease. The Inquisition is the cure. Through such words, he convinced the monarchs that the Church's purges were necessary for national stability. And they believed him. When the Inquisition struck down heretics, it did more than defend doctrine. It silenced political dissent. When it seized property, it enriched the crown. When it executed public figures, it warned the ambitious. The rack, the rope, and the flame were instruments not only of faith, but of rule. Spain's nobles soon learned to fear the Holy Office as much as they feared the king. The Inquisition's courts operated beyond royal law, yet their judgments benefited the throne. Lands confiscated from condemned families were often granted to loyalists. Gold taken from accused merchants filled royal treasuries. Even the smallest heresy could yield political reward. In 1497, the Marquess of Villena, one of Spain's most powerful nobles, was accused of maintaining unclean blood. He had converted ancestors among the Moors, it was said. The accusation came from a rival family with close ties to the Inquisition. The Marquess was stripped of his title, his estates seized, and his heirs barred from office. The rival family, devoutly Catholic, inherited much of his wealth. The crown turned a blind eye. After all, the trial had been conducted in God's name.
The Inquisition's authority also extended to diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors feared its power. Foreign rulers respected it. Spain's commitment to religious uniformity became a symbol of national strength, a warning to all who might oppose it. Even the Pope himself tread carefully. When Rome expressed concern over the severity of Spain's purges, Ferdinand replied coldly, "The Pope may rule the souls of men, but we rule their bodies." And so, the Crown's alliance with the Inquisition grew stronger than its allegiance to the Church itself. Behind the grand sermons and public burnings, political games unfolded in whispers. The Inquisition was both sword
and shield, used to destroy enemies and protect allies. A rival courtier could be accused of heresy and vanish within days. A rebellious province could be subdued not with soldiers, but with a few carefully chosen denunciations. No rebellion could survive the weight of divine suspicion. Inquisitors carried more power than generals. Their words could crush a noble, erase a lineage, and reshape politics overnight. In one chilling letter, preserved from 1502, a royal advisor wrote, "The Inquisition keeps the kingdom loyal, for none dare conspire, when God listens at every door." The alliance between the crown and the church reshaped Spain itself. The monarchy financed voyages to the New World, and the Inquisition followed. Missionaries carried the cross across oceans, spreading the faith by sword and sermon. Yet as gold and silver flowed into Spain, the same fires that burned heretics also burned curiosity. Books were banned. Ideas were censored. The same authority that built an empire also shackled its mind. Spain's scholars fled to Italy and France, seeking freedom of thought. Those who remained learned to write in allegory and whisper in secret. The Inquisition called this unity. History calls it silence. But even teens learned that the cross could cut both ways. In 1559, King Philip II, devout, austere, and fanatically Catholic, sought to strengthen his control over the church itself. He demanded that inquisitors report directly to him. For a time, it worked. But soon the Inquisition became so powerful that even the crown feared it. Inquisitors began investigating noble families close to the throne. They spied on ambassadors, bishops, and even royal advisors. The line between loyalty and heresy blurred again, this time to the monarch's disadvantage. By giving the church the power to destroy rebellion, the crown had also given it the power to judge kings. In the court of Philip II, the Inquisition's presence was everywhere. Its agents walked the palace corridors, listening. Its priests attended royal feasts, silent and observant. Even the king's confessor, his most trusted counselor, was an inquisitor. Foreign diplomats joked that Spain was not ruled by a man, but by a council of priests. They were not far wrong. Every royal decree bore the shadow of the Holy Office. Every law was weighed against theology. Even matters of war and trade were justified in terms of divine will. To disobey the king was treason. To question the Inquisition was blasphemy. And so Spain became a kingdom where politics wore the face of God. The system worked for a time. Under the Inquisition's watchful eye, Spain rose to become the most powerful empire in the world. Gold from the Americas filled its coffers. Armadas sailed beneath its flag. Priests baptized entire nations. But the same fire that purified also consumed. As decades passed, the crown grew dependent on fear. Innovation stagnated. Trade faltered. Those who might have led Spain into modernity, thinkers, scientists, explorers, were silenced or exiled. The Inquisition, once the instrument of power, became its parasite. In the end, the crown and the cross shared the same fate, bound together, unable to separate. When Spain's empire began to crumble in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Inquisition remained, clinging to its authority even as the world around it changed. Kings came and went, popes rose and fell, but the tribunals continued to meet in shadowed chambers, writing new names into old books. And though their fires dimmed, their purpose endured, to preserve the illusion that obedience was holiness and silence was peace.
In one of his final letters, a disillusioned court advisor wrote to his son, "Do not trust the men of the robe or the men of the crown, for both wear masks. One calls his greed faith, the other calls his fear duty. Between them, truth is crucified daily." His letter was never sent. It was found years later in the Inquisition's archives, unopened, unread, sealed with wax.
The political cross of Spain was more than a symbol. It was a pact, a covenant written in fire, signed in blood, and sealed in silence. It taught the world a lesson still true today, that when religion and power become one, neither serves God, they only serve themselves. And beneath the shadow of that cross, countless souls were crushed between the weight of the crown and the weight of the faith. The bells of Madrid rang with solemn rhythm, their echo rolling across the rooftops like distant thunder. It was Sunday, the day of faith, of confession, of power. The streets shimmered with sunlight, but in the royal palace, the light fell dimly through tall stained glass windows. At the far end of the grand hall, a priest raised the host. The king bowed his head. Faith and royalty stood side by side, not in harmony, but in mutual captivity. For by now, in the height of Spain's golden age, the throne and the altar had fused into one. Each claimed to serve God, yet each served the other. The church blessed the monarch's rule, and the monarch protected the church's dominion. Together, they built a kingdom that worshipped obedience as holiness and silence as virtue. And at the center of that kingdom stood the Inquisition, the invisible thread binding the cross to the crown. The union of church and state was not born of love, but of necessity. After centuries of conquest and civil war, Spain craved order. Faith offered what swords could not, the illusion of unity. Kings needed the pulpit's authority. Priests needed the sword's protection. Together, they created a system that turned belief into law and law into belief. From the pulpits, priests preached that the king ruled by divine right, chosen by God to guard the realm of souls. From the throne, decrees declared the church sacred and untouchable, the voice of heaven itself. It was a perfect circle of control. To obey the church was to obey the king. To disobey either was to defy both, and, by extension, to defy God. In practice, this alliance made Spain both glorious and fragile. Gold from the New World poured into royal coffers, building cathedrals and palaces whose splendor outshone Rome itself. Yet every coin carried the echo of the whip, the labor of slaves, the blood of those who died in conquest, the souls burned for belief.
Spain called itself La Nación de Dios, the nation of God. But in truth, it had become a kingdom where the divine was used as armor for ambition. The monarch ruled from the palace, the church ruled from the altar, and between them, the Inquisition ruled from the shadows. The priests of the Inquisition were the messengers between throne and altar. They carried secrets, whispered decrees, and divine judgments. Inquisitors advised the king on which nobles could be trusted, which provinces were corrupted by false faith, which merchants' loyalty was suspect. In return, the crown shielded them from criticism. No law could touch a servant of the Holy Office. No man could question their verdict. Even bishops bowed before their authority. One nobleman once remarked, "The king may command Spain, but the Inquisition commands his soul." He was right. Philip II, the devout monarch who reigned at the height of Spain's empire, embodied this union perfectly. He rose each morning before dawn to hear Mass. He dined in silence, fasted often, and kept a monk's discipline in his private life. Yet, in his name, fleets of ships conquered new lands, heretics were burned in thousands, and dissent was crushed beneath the seal of holiness. In his palace, the great monastery of El Escorial, the chapel and the throne room stood side by side, divided only by a narrow corridor. The king could pass from worship to rule without ever leaving the building. The design was deliberate. It was meant to remind all who entered that in Spain, God and the king were one voice. Inquisitors were frequent guests in El Escorial. They dined at the royal table, advised on foreign policy, even oversaw the censorship of books brought from Italy or France. Philip trusted no man more than his confessor, the Inquisitor General Diego de Espinosa, a sharp-eyed priest who combined holiness with ruthless pragmatism. It was Espinosa who convinced the king to expand the Inquisition's reach into the colonies, to ensure that new souls of the Indies be taught not only the faith, but obedience. To spread the gospel, he said, was to spread order. The flames that once burned in Seville now glowed in Mexico, Lima, Cartagena, and Manila. But such unity came at a price. As the church and crown merged, the Spanish people were crushed beneath their weight. Tithes filled the church's coffers, taxes drained the peasants' purses, Inquisition courts devoured the wealthy, royal wars consumed the poor. Faith became obligation, loyalty became currency, and fear became the air Spain breathed.
In villages, priests read royal decrees from the pulpit. In cities, royal soldiers escorted prisoners to ecclesiastical trials. There was no boundary left between divine justice and political control. The king's banners carried the cross, the church's judgments carried the seal of the crown, and the people carried both upon their backs. This fusion of faith and rule also silenced voices of progress. Philosophers, poets, and scientists who questioned church doctrine were branded as heretics. The works of Erasmus, Copernicus, and Galileo were banned. Scholars who studied medicine or astronomy were warned that too much curiosity endangers the soul. In Spain, ignorance became virtue. The king's advisors celebrated conformity as stability. The Inquisition ensured that ideas like heresy were extinguished before they could spread. Thus, while the rest of Europe marched toward the Renaissance, Spain built walls of sanctified darkness around itself. The throne and the altar stood tall, but beneath them, knowledge withered. There were, however, cracks in this holy alliance. Even within the church, whispers grew. Some priests began to question the morality of the Inquisition's methods. Some nobles wondered whether faith should serve politics or remain apart from it. Letters from these dissenters were intercepted, censored, and filed in the archives of the Holy Office. One bishop, whose name was later erased from history, wrote to the king in secret, "Your Majesty, the cross should bless the throne, not bind it. If the church becomes a weapon of kings, who will protect the people from both?" He was never seen again. As decades passed, the alliance began to devour itself. The crown grew weary of the Inquisition's interference in state matters. The church grew suspicious of royal greed. Each depended on the other too deeply to break apart, yet both resented the chains that bound them together.
The Inquisition's spies reported to the Crown, and the Crown's agents reported to the Inquisition. Suspicion became mutual, a serpent devouring its own tail. What had once been unity became paranoia.
In the 17th century, Spain's empire began to crumble under its own sanctified weight. The economy faltered, colonies rebelled, and wars drained the treasury. Yet still the Church preached patience. Suffering purifies the soul, the priests said. Our trials are God's will. The kings echoed the same message. We are chosen to endure. Neither saw that the fire that once cleansed had begun to consume them. And so the altar and the throne, once the twin pillars of Spain, began to crack. When Enlightenment ideas swept through Europe, Spain's walls of faith could not hold forever. The people began to question, to doubt, to dream of freedom unblessed by bishops or kings. By the 18th century, the Inquisition's power waned, its records gathering dust, its tribunals fewer and fewer. The last flames burned not with triumph, but with desperation, as though the Church tried to hold on to a world that no longer feared it. But even after the fires died, the shadow remained. The legacy of that union, of church and crown, of altar and throne, endured long after both lost their dominion. Spain would carry its imprint for centuries, suspicion of dissent, fear of difference, reverence for authority disguised as faith. The alliance had promised heaven on earth. Instead, it delivered silence. If you walk through El Escorial today, you can still see the corridor between the chapel and the throne room, narrow, cold, and silent. The marble floor gleams like water, reflecting both cross and crown in the same mirrored surface. It is beautiful. It is haunting. It is Spain's reflection, forever caught between devotion and domination. The night before his execution, Father Alonso de la Cruz dreamed of water. Not fire, not chains, not the echoing prayers of his inquisitors, but a river, silent and wide, flowing through a field of silver light. In that dream, he saw himself walking toward it, barefoot, robes torn, yet at peace. On the far bank stood faces, hundreds of them, men and women he had once condemned, now waiting for him in silence. When he reached the edge of the river, he looked down and saw that the water was red. He woke to the toll of the cathedral bells. Morning had come, and with it, judgment. Father Alonso was once an inquisitor himself. He had served the holy office faithfully, believing that pain was a path to truth. He had read the confessions, signed the sentences, prayed over the dying. But something had broken inside him. It happened the night he watched a young girl, barely 16, burn for witchcraft. She had looked at him through the flames, not with hate, but with pity. And in that moment, something shifted. He began to wonder if perhaps God was not in the fire at all, but in her eyes. He left the Inquisition soon after, vanishing into the countryside. For years he wandered, preaching love, mercy, and the possibility of a faith without fear. His words spread quietly, until one day they reached the ears of the Inquisition. Now he sat in the same cell where he had once interrogated others. The irony was not lost on him. The cell was small and damp. A narrow slit in the wall let in a sliver of light, cutting across the stone floor like a blade. He had not slept much. The dreams came every night. Rivers, smoke, faces, memories that clung to him like a shadow. A guard entered, carrying bread and water. "Your last meal, Father," he said softly. Alonso smiled faintly. "It seems I have given many such meals in my time." The guard hesitated. "Is it true, then, that you repent of the Church?"
The old man shook his head. No, I repent of seer. The guard said nothing more. He left the bread untouched. Outside, in the great square of Valladolid, a stage was already being prepared. The wood was stacked high, the banners of the crown and the cross fluttering in the wind. The crowd gathered early. The auto da fe was always an event. Children perched on barrels, vendors sold oranges and wine, and priests rehearsed their chants. The Inquisition had learned long ago that executions were not just punishment, they were performance. But for Alonso, this day was something else. It was his absolution. At dawn, he was led from his cell by 2 friars. They walked slowly through the corridors, past doors that hid the cries of the living and the ghosts of the dead. At the end of the hall, he paused before the crucifix carved into the wall. "Forgive me," he whispered, "not for what I failed to believe, but for what I once believed too much." When they reached the courtyard, the sun was just breaking over the horizon. They dressed him in the San Benito, the yellow robe of the condemned, painted with black crosses and tongues of flame. His hands were bound, but his head was held high. The crowd parted as he walked, murmuring prayers, curses, and pity. He was to be burned not as a blasphemer, but as a relapsed heretic, a man who had known the truth of the Church and turned away from it. For such souls there was no mercy. Yet as he walked, he felt no fear. He had seen fear too many times, in others, in himself. He knew it was only another form of faith misplaced.
They led him to the platform. The inquisitor read the charges in a voice that echoed across the plaza. Father Alonso de la Cruz, for the crimes of heresy, of blasphemy, and of teaching false doctrine, is hereby remitted to the secular arm, to be punished according to justice and the laws of God. Alonso listened quietly. When the reading ended, the friar beside him leaned close. "Confess now," he urged. "Save your soul." The old man smiled. "My soul was never lost, only borrowed." The friar stepped back, shaken. As the torches touched the pyre, the crowd grew silent. The fire hissed and flared, orange tongues licking the sky. For a moment, Alonso closed his eyes and thought of the river again, wide and calm, waiting beyond the smoke. He felt the heat rise, felt his robes ignite, and in that instant he whispered the words that had haunted him since the day he left the Inquisition. Truth is not what burns, it is what survives the fire. Then the flames roared, and the crowd began to pray. Alonso's death was not the end of the heretic's dreams. Across Spain, whispers spread of men and women who dared to believe in a gentler God. They met in secret, in basements and cellars, beneath the gaze of the Church. They called themselves Los Silenciosos, the silent ones. They were former priests, scholars, nuns, and ordinary souls who had seen too much of the Inquisition's cruelty. They refused to renounce their faith, but they no longer trusted those who claimed to speak for it. They shared copies of forbidden texts, Erasmus, Saint Francis, even the poetry of Moorish mystics. They prayed not in Latin, but in their own tongues. Their gatherings were small, but their courage immense. Every few years, the Inquisition discovered one of their circles. Some were imprisoned, others burned. But each time, another group would rise, quieter, wiser, more careful. Their dream
was not rebellion. It was redemption. One of these followers, a young nun named Isabel de Aranda, wrote in her diary before she was captured, "They call us heretics because we believe God is love, not fear. But if he created fire, then surely he meant it for warmth, not for judgment."
Her words were found decades later, hidden in the false bottom of a prayer book. They would inspire countless others, though none would know her name. The heretic's dream was not only spiritual, it was political, intellectual, human. They dreamed of a Spain where questions were not crimes, where thought was not chained by theology. They dreamed of a church that healed rather than condemned, a faith that did not require suffering to prove itself. For centuries, that dream flickered beneath the ashes, dim, fragile, yet alive. It would take the Enlightenment, revolutions, and reformations before the world began to see it realized. But it began here, in the whispered prayers of the condemned, in the trembling hands of those who refused to let fear define their God. Centuries later, in the ruins of an old Inquisition prison in Valladolid, archaeologists found a small piece of parchment sealed inside the wall. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. It read, "We burned, but we were not consumed." No one knows who wrote it. Perhaps Alonso, perhaps Isabel, perhaps a nameless prisoner who dreamed of light while surrounded by darkness. But those words, simple, defiant, eternal, became the true confession of an age. The Inquisition thought it could erase faith through control, purify belief through pain. But the heretics taught the opposite, that faith cannot be forced, and truth cannot be burned. Every flame the church lit became a spark in another heart. Every silence imposed became a seed of rebellion. And though the Inquisition's prisons have long since crumbled, its ghosts still whisper, not as warnings, but as reminders. Because in every age there are inquisitions of one form or another, and in every age there are heretics who dare to dream. Tonight, if you listen closely, you might still hear them. Their voices rise not from the stake, but from the wind, gentle, persistent, free. The dream continues. By the time the fires of the Spanish Inquisition had blackened every square from Seville to Valladolid, their smoke had already drifted beyond Spain's borders. It rolled across mountains and seas, carrying with it both fear and fascination. Europe watched in horror and envy. The spectacle of Spain's holy terror, cloaked in piety and crowned with order, stirred something dark in the hearts of kings and cardinals. They saw not the suffering, but the efficiency, not the screams, but the control. What Spain had done with faith, others would soon try to do with law, with loyalty, with power. The Inquisition had begun as a Spanish flame, but its echoes became the pulse of an entire continent. The first to follow was Portugal. In 1536, King João III petitioned Pope Paul III for permission to establish his own holy office. He claimed it was needed to protect his kingdom from heresy, but in truth, he wanted what Spain had, authority sanctified by God. Within a year, Portuguese inquisitors were walking the streets of Lisbon, their robes black, their crosses silver. The same symbols appeared, the San Benito, the rack, the stake. The same language was spoken, the rhetoric of purification. But Portugal's Inquisition carried an even deeper cruelty. It targeted not only conversos and Judaizers, but also sailors, merchants, and explorers returning from the New World. Men accused of bringing home strange idols or foreign gods. They called it the cleansing of the seas. Ships docked in Lisbon under banners of discovery, only for their captains to vanish into the prisons of the Holy Office. The fires that had burned in Seville now burned on the shores of the Atlantic. Across the Pyrenees, France watched carefully. France had its own heresies, most notably the Huguenots, whose Protestant beliefs were spreading like wildfire through the south. The French monarchy admired Spain's ability to unify faith and state through terror. And so when the French crown began its own persecutions, it did not call them inquisitions, but it followed their blueprint. Courts of religious correction were established. Confessions were extracted. Public executions became sermons. In 1572, the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day stained Paris red. Thousands of Protestants were slaughtered in the name of God. It was not an inquisition in name, but in spirit, it was its twin. The Spanish model had proven contagious.
Further north, the echoes took another form. In Italy, the Papal States created the Roman Inquisition, founded in 1542 under Pope Paul III, the same pope who had approved Portugal's Holy Office. But the Roman Inquisition was more subtle, more intellectual. Its victims were not peasants or midwives, but thinkers. Philosophers, scientists, and artists found themselves before its tribunals. One of them was Giordano Bruno, a Dominican friar who dared to speak of infinite worlds, of stars as suns with their own planets. He believed creation was too vast for the Church's narrow heavens. For that belief, he was imprisoned for 8 years. When persuasion failed, they turned to fire. In 1600, Bruno was burned in the Campo di Fiori in Rome. His last words were said to be, "You burn me now, but it is you who are consumed." The smoke that rose over Rome that day was the same smoke that had once risen over Spain. It carried the same scent of sanctity and of fear. But even in Protestant nations that had broken from Rome, the echoes still sounded. In England, Queen Mary Tudor, daughter of the very monarchs who had founded Spain's Inquisition, revived her parents' methods with zeal. Between 1555 and 1558, she ordered nearly 300 Protestants burned at the stake. The English called her Bloody Mary. And though her reign was short, it left an indelible mark. The Inquisition's fire had crossed the sea, not as an institution, but as an idea, that righteousness could justify cruelty, that God could be invoked to sanctify terror. In Germany and Central Europe, the echoes became more grotesque still. The Inquisition's methods inspired the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. Across Bavaria, Bohemia, and the Rhineland, inquisitors' manuals circulated, translated, adapted, perfected. The Spanish Inquisition's Manual for the Interrogation of Heretics became a guidebook for witch finders. Its rules for torture and confession were rewritten for new crimes: pact with the devil, flying at night, dancing under the moon. Tens of thousands of women were tortured and executed across Europe. The inquisitors called it the purification of Christendom. The flames that once burned for faith now burned for superstition.
Even the Holy Roman Empire, fractured by war and religion, could not escape the echo. In 1618, as the 30 Years' War began, both Catholic and Protestant forces used the rhetoric of the Inquisition to justify slaughter. Each side claimed to be purging heresy from the other. Towns were razed, entire regions burned. When the war finally ended, Europe was a graveyard of faith. The Spanish Inquisition's language of purification, of divine justice, of cleansing, had become the vocabulary of tyranny itself. But the echo was not only heard in Europe's halls of power, it lingered in its art, its philosophy, its very soul. Writers like Cervantes, Lope de Vega, and later Voltaire and Diderot wrestled with the Inquisition's shadow. Cervantes, who had fought and suffered imprisonment himself, wrote of hypocrisy and illusion in Don Quixote, a satire that mocked the blindness of faith twisted into madness. Voltaire, centuries later, would rage against l'infâme, the infamy of the Church's cruelty, calling the Inquisition the embodiment of mankind's most dangerous delusion, the belief that one can torture another into truth. Those who can make you believe absurdities, Voltaire wrote, can make you commit atrocities. His words were the Enlightenment's revenge against centuries of sanctified terror. By the 18th century, the echo had changed tone. The same Europe that once trembled before the Inquisition's judges now began to dismantle them. Spain's tribunals still operated, but their authority was waning. Philosophers mocked them, citizens defied them, and foreign powers condemned them. The fire no longer inspired fear, it inspired shame. In 1808, Napoleon's armies marched into Spain, and his soldiers tore down the symbols of the Holy Office. The archives were looted, the dungeons emptied, and the inquisitors scattered. And though the Inquisition would briefly return after his defeat, it was no longer the mighty institution of old. Its echo had grown faint, drowned by the roar of revolution. But even as the old world burned away, the Inquisition's legacy endured, not in religion, but in systems of power. Its structure, surveillance, confession, and control became the model for future regimes. From secret police to political purges, from censorship offices to propaganda ministries, the mechanics of fear it invented outlived its theology. The Inquisition had taught the world how to dominate not just the body, but the conscience.
Centuries later, when philosophers looked back at that era, they realized that the Inquisition's greatest crime was not physical torture, it was intellectual. It taught generations to doubt their own thoughts, to fear their own questions, to equate obedience with virtue. It had burned heretics, but worse, it had burned curiosity. That is the true echo that still lingers across Europe, the hesitation to think freely when authority calls its voice divine. If you walk today through the plazas of Europe, in Seville, Lisbon, Rome, or Paris, the monuments tell a different story. Statues of saints and kings stand proudly, but beneath them lie the invisible ashes of those who were silenced. No plaque names them. No hymns are sung for them. But the wind that moves through those streets still carries their voices, faint, persistent, unyielding. The Inquisition's echo, once a scream, is now a whisper, but it remains a warning that no empire, no faith, no ideology, however holy it claims to be, should ever hold the right to decide what others may believe. For every time it does, the old fires flicker again, in different forms, in different ages, reminding us that the echo of one Inquisition can become the foundation of the next. The last fires of the Inquisition did not go out with thunder. They died with a whisper. For nearly 4 centuries, the Spanish Inquisition had ruled with holy terror. Its prisons had overflowed. Its pyres had smoked against the skies of Seville, Toledo, and Madrid. But by the dawn of the 18th century, the air of Europe had changed. A new wind was rising, one of reason. The age of faith was dimming,
and the age of thought had begun. In the salons of Paris, philosophers debated truth not as revelation, but as discovery. In London, scientists charted the heavens with telescopes instead of prayers. Even in Spain, bound in centuries of fear, the walls of silence began to crack. Students whispered the names of forbidden thinkers, Voltaire, Locke, Descartes. Ideas traveled in secret, hidden between pages of Bibles and prayer books. And yet, the Inquisition still breathed. It still sat in its stone halls, its inquisitors cloaked in black, its crosses polished, its seals unbroken. But its voice no longer inspired awe, only weariness. The people were tired of fear. The sermons no longer stirred the heart. The pyres no longer sanctified. The holy office, once the iron hand of God, had become a shadow of itself, an old man muttering prayers to a deaf world.
In 1700, when Charles II died without an heir, the Spanish Empire trembled. War tore across Europe, and for the first time, the Inquisition found itself uncertain. Its power had always depended on unity: one king, one faith, one people. But now Spain's enemies mocked its superstition, calling it the kingdom of ghosts. Even Rome began to distance itself. Popes who once blessed the flames now called for mercy. They did not condemn the Inquisition outright, but they turned their faces away. In the cities, young scholars spoke of progress. They questioned the old ways, the endless rituals, the blind obedience. Priests warned them to stay silent, and they did, at least in public. But the whisper of reason had entered Spain, and it would not be exorcised. The Inquisition tried to adapt. It banned books instead of burning bodies. A new kind of trial began, one fought not with fire, but with censorship. By decree, the Inquisition became the censor of all thought in Spain. It compiled vast lists of forbidden works: the spirit of the laws, Candide, the social contract. Even novels, plays, and medical texts were blacklisted. The inquisitors called this the Index of Prohibited Books, a library of fear. At the ports of Cadiz and Barcelona, inquisitors searched incoming ships for printed heresy. They tore pages from foreign texts and burned them in the squares, declaring it an act of purification. But the age of information was already beyond their reach. For every book burned, 10 more entered, hidden in cargo or copied by hand. The fire that once consumed flesh now consumed paper, and still it lost. By the mid-1700s, Spain's philosophers, the Ilustrados, had begun to push back openly. Figures like Benito Feijó, a Benedictine monk, dared to write essays challenging superstition and fanaticism. He said, "Faith is the light of the soul, but ignorance is the shadow cast by faith's misuse." He was accused of heresy. He was never tried. The Inquisition, now weary and bureaucratic, hesitated to strike at men beloved by the public. The people were no longer silent. Even the nobles had grown skeptical. When the inquisitors denounced an astronomer for teaching that the earth moved around the sun, one Spanish noble replied dryly, "And does the earth stop moving when you condemn it?" For the first time in centuries, laughter, not fear, followed the Inquisition's words.
In 1808, the thunder finally came.
Napoleon's armies marched into Spain, sweeping aside centuries of divine rule. French soldiers looted churches, seized castles, and tore down the emblems of the Holy Office. When they reached the Inquisition's headquarters in Madrid, they found the archives. Thousands of files stretching across the walls like veins of power. The soldiers threw open the doors, expecting gold, relics, treasure. What they found instead were bones and silence. They burned the papers, smashed the seals, freed the prisoners. The Holy Office was abolished by decree. For the first time in 300 years, Spain was free of the Inquisition. But freedom is never simple. When Napoleon fell, Spain's monarchy returned, and with it, the old fear. In 1814, King Ferdinand VII restored the Inquisition, declaring it the guardian of the Spanish soul. Yet the world had changed. The people did not kneel, the philosophers did not hide, and even the church began to falter. The restored Inquisition was a corpse pretending to breathe. Its tribunals held few trials, its prisons half empty. The crowds no longer came to the plazas, the pyres stood cold. In 1820, the people rose again, this time not with swords, but with words. A new constitution demanded liberty of conscience. The Inquisition was abolished once more. Ferdinand abolished it again when he regained power. Then again it fell. It died and rose, like a ghost refusing to leave the house it once ruled. The final blow came in 1834. Queen Regent Maria Cristina signed the decree that ended the Spanish Inquisition forever. No bells tolled, no sermons thundered. The last inquisitors packed their papers, their crucifixes, their robes, and left the dark chambers for the last time. The prisons were emptied, the archives sealed. The Holy Office was gone. But its shadow lingered in the habits of obedience, the fear of authority, and the silence that clung to Spanish life for generations. Freedom had returned, but faith had been broken. When the last Grand Inquisitor, Geronimo Castiglione Salas, died in 1835, the Church did not honor him. His funeral was small, his tomb unmarked. The institution he had served for life was already a memory the nation wished to forget. Yet, even in its death, the Inquisition left behind the architecture of control, the idea that morality could be enforced by fear. That ideology, once born, never truly died. It simply changed its name. In the decades that followed, Spain wrestled with its ghosts. Writers, historians, and revolutionaries dug through the ashes, searching for meaning in the madness. Some blamed religion, some blamed kings. But most realized the truth, that the Inquisition had thrived because people were afraid, not of God, but of each other. Fear had been the true faith of the Spanish Empire. In 1869, the new Spanish Constitution declared, "No one shall be persecuted for religious opinions." It was a sentence centuries in the making, a quiet rebuke to all who had burned, tortured, and silenced in God's name. But even then, the old fear whispered in the dark corners of Spain, in classrooms, in confessions, in families. The Inquisition was gone, but the idea that power could disguise itself as righteousness had not vanished. It never does. Today, in museums and archives across Spain, the remnants of the Holy Office remain. Robes blackened by smoke, instruments of torture rusted with age, parchments sealed with wax and dust.
Visitors walk through those halls in silence, not because they are told to, but because the walls still seem to hum with echoes, the prayers of the condemned, the whispers of the fearful, the sighs of those who survived. If you lean close enough, you might almost hear it, a voice murmuring through the centuries. The fire has died, but the ashes remember. The fall of the Inquisition was not an ending. It was a warning, one that history repeats whenever faith and power intertwine, whenever men claim the right to judge in the name of heaven. The Holy Office may have burned its last heretic in 1834, but its lessons still burn today, that fear can wear the mask of faith, that silence can be sanctified, and that the truest heresy is not doubt, but the refusal to question.
The fire has long gone cold. The squares where thousands once burned are silent now, their stones washed clean by rain and centuries. Tourists walk across them, cameras in hand, unaware that beneath their feet lie the ashes of a world consumed by faith and fear. But the story of the Inquisition does not end where the flames died. Its spirit lived on, not in cathedrals or tribunals, but in the way power learned to speak through faith, and faith learned to obey power. These are the ashes of power, the remnants of an empire built on belief and the warning it left for every age that followed. When the Inquisition finally fell in 1834, Spain exhaled as though awakening from a long nightmare. The Holy Office was abolished, the prisons emptied, the archives sealed. But though the Church had been stripped of its tribunal, the habits of obedience it created lingered, like the scent of smoke in old stone. People still crossed themselves before speaking dangerous thoughts. Writers still cloaked truth in allegory. Citizens still watched their neighbors, suspicious of difference. The Inquisition was gone, but the idea that safety could be purchased with silence, that fear could be virtue, remained. The 19th century brought revolutions and republics, kings and generals, yet through it all, the ghost of the Inquisition shadowed Spanish politics. When dissent arose, rulers used familiar words: purge, cleanse, purify. When rebellion flared, they invoked God. When they needed obedience, they promised protection. Every tyrant borrows from the same liturgy. Even the tools of control evolved, but never vanished. Censorship replaced confession. Surveillance replaced prayer. The interrogations became political, not spiritual, but the goal remained the same: to make the individual bow to the collective will. The Inquisition had taught the world that the most effective form of power is not the sword, but the conscience trained to fear it. Spain, like much of Europe, carried this legacy into the modern era. In the 20th century, when General Francisco Franco seized power, he resurrected the language of the Church to justify dictatorship. His Spain was a land of crosses and slogans: one faith, one nation. He called his regime La Cruzada, the Crusade. He filled prisons instead of dungeons, censored books instead of heretics, but the machinery was familiar. Priests blessed his armies. Bishops stood beside him on the balcony. The Inquisition's robes had changed color, but its hand still held the same torch.
In sermons and classrooms, obedience was preached as patriotism, silence as loyalty. Once again, the altar and the throne stood side by side, and truth was whatever they declared it to be. Yet even under dictatorship, the embers of defiance glowed. Writers, artists, and philosophers resurrected the voices that the Inquisition had tried to erase. They wrote of the forgotten, the silenced, the burned. In poetry and film, they transformed Spain's hidden wounds into art. Federico Garcia Lorca wrote of love and loss under the shadow of oppression. Luis Buñuel's films mocked hypocrisy and blind devotion. And through them, Spain began to reclaim what centuries of terror had stolen: its humanity. When Franco's regime finally fell in 1975, Spain emerged blinking into the light of democracy. But it did not emerge unscarred. The question remained: how does a nation heal from 400 years of fear disguised as faith? In the decades that followed, Spain began to confront its past. Historians opened the sealed archives of the Inquisition. Scholars read the confessions once thought lost, the words of the condemned, the signatures of their tormentors. They discovered that the records of faith were also records of control, written proof of how easily the sacred can be corrupted when it serves the powerful. Museums were built in the ruins of old prisons. Tours were offered of former torture chambers. Schools began to teach what had once been forbidden to speak. The truth, at last, began to breathe. And yet the story of the Inquisition is not only Spain's. Its legacy crosses borders and centuries. In every system that demands loyalty over truth, in every ideology that punishes dissent, in every government that calls obedience virtue, the Inquisition's ghost stirs. It lives in propaganda that sanctifies leaders, in mobs that burn books, in algorithms that monitor thought. It lives wherever fear replaces reason, and conformity masquerades as righteousness. The robes may have changed, the language modernized, but the pattern remains. Power always seeks to make itself holy.
The true lesson of the Inquisition is not that religion is dangerous. It is that any belief, when fused with absolute power, becomes an instrument of cruelty. Faith was not the villain. Fear was. And fear is a language every tyrant speaks fluently. The inquisitors believed they were saving souls. The kings believed they were protecting unity. The people believed they were serving God. Each, in their own way, was both victim and accomplice. That is how terror thrives, not through monsters, but through believers. In the quiet of modern cathedrals, where tourists now wander with guidebooks in soft whispers, a strange peace lingers. The incense burns, the choirs sing, and beneath the marble floors lie bones once broken in the name of salvation. They are not saints. They are not sinners. They are the price of power unchallenged. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear them still, not screaming, not cursing, but whispering, "Remember." Spain remembers. Every November, in towns across the country, candles are lit for los olvidados, the forgotten ones. No names are spoken because so many were lost, but the act itself is enough, the light of memory against centuries of darkness. It is not forgiveness they seek, but acknowledgement, because forgetting is the final victory of tyranny. The Inquisition began with a promise: purity through faith, salvation through control. It ended in ashes. Yet from those ashes rose something unexpected: the idea that truth must belong to all, not to one church, one king, or one belief. The enlightenment that followed was not born in the universities of Paris or the coffee houses of London alone. It was born, too, in the flames of Spain. In the eyes of those who died refusing to bow, in the hands of those who wrote their last words in darkness.
400 years of fear,
cannot erase the human spirit. And so, the final legacy of the Inquisition is not its cruelty. It is the courage it accidentally revealed. The courage to question, to doubt, to think freely, even when the cost was life itself. Because in the end, every empire of fear must face the same truth. The human mind, once awakened, cannot be chained forever. The Inquisition fell. Its fire died. But the heretic's dream, the dream of freedom, endured. If you stand today in the plazas of Seville or Madrid at dusk, when the air turns gold and the bells toll in the distance, you might feel it, that quiet hum beneath the surface of the stones. It is not the sound of fire. It is the sound of memory. It is the voice of history whispering through the centuries. Faith without compassion is tyranny. Power without doubt is hell. And silence, when truth is burning, is the truest heresy of all.